Hey YouTube, it's David from Live Forever or Die Trying, and today we have a new segment for you, which is Past the Cover, where basically we look at a book a little bit more in depth, try to give you a more full feel of what it's about, and then dive into some of the topics a little bit deeper. With me today, I have Raymond, who's from my book club. I guess actually his book club. He started this originally. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Raymond. I'm a software engineer, and I actually found David on, I believe, Goodreads, and then through that found his YouTube channel, and we set up like a regular reading thing through that. Um, so yeah, this was supposed to be, more in-depth book review. I'm a big fan of the channel, so I think that it would be cool to kind of discuss something that we both thought was interesting. A comment I'm going to make is that I actually am a volunteer inside Andrew Yang's Humanity Forward nonprofit, which is a group that aims to spread the UBI idea from both like congressional messaging as well as spreading awareness.
And we're definitely going to jump into like more of a deep dive for UBI itself. But to start off with, we're going to recap the book. And this is The War on Normal People by Andrew Yang, The Truth About America's Disappearing Jobs and Why Universal Basic Income is Our Future. And an important thing to note is Andrew actually wrote this and published it in April of 2018. Kind of in response to the Trump presidency and what he was seeing happening in America.
The time that he put this out was pretty important because I think that this was put out at this time because of his like considering running for the presidency. So I feel like, a book like this with a lot of focus on UBI and also talking a lot about his experience, talking to other individuals that he knows who are struggling because of the variety of factors that he mentions, I think plays a big factor into how this book is narrated.
So, in my opinion, this book is split into three main segments. The first, he kind of does a little introduction on his life and where he's come from. In my opinion, in an effort to kind of humanize himself and give you the sympathies with why he's writing this book. So, Yang originally, I believe, for 5 months was a lawyer, and then was the next step that he didn't jump right into Venture for America, his nonprofit. He
Yeah, he had a number of entrepreneurial ventures. Um, some of them were tech related, um, and I think another one of them was a nonprofit.
but we'll link all of that in the description below.
Yeah,
But he kind of sets this up to let you know that he has kind of been around the different demographics of America. He sets this up to show you that he's had conversations with the kind of tech bros of Silicon Valley and the kind of the 1%, if you will. But also, he talks a lot about his travels between the major cities and why he was kind of turned on into this noticing this lack of joblessness, this epidemic that's kind of sweeping past
you
America.
mean this presence of joblessness, not the lack of joblessness.
Absolutely. And so one of the common things he kind of wants to bust the myth on is that jobs are not being lost because of like immigration or one of these other talking points that you hear on the news more often. It's actually related to automation itself and kind of increases of efficiency within the workforce through no fault of the individual's own pushing them out of the workforce.
Although, different people point to different factors for job gains and job loss, I feel like every politician has their own story around jobs, and it actually kind of creates your campaign, what your narrative is around the jobs that can be created. And his narrative is, all right, basically, there are several very large tech companies right now that are automating away many relatively not well paying uh, jobs that employ a large number of Americans. So he points to things like food service, to people like who work in call centers, and then he points to, this is something that he'll mention in speeches all the time too, is automation of truck driving and regular car driving. And this is kind of his narrative, you know, Amazon warehouses. And he basically points out all these different sectors of people who have in recent times had their jobs automated. And the fact that they are now struggling is, you know, he points to this correlating to Donald Trump's election, as well as the American population just being more distressed as a whole.
And then after he kind of lays that out, he goes to define, you know, who is the normal person that is being affected by this. And I just have this tabbed off real quickly. I'll read, which he says, so what is normal? The normal American did not graduate from college, does not have an associate's degree. He or she attended college for 1 year or graduated from high school, has a net worth of approximately $36,000 or $6,000 excluding their home and vehicle equity, and they live paycheck to paycheck. He or she has less than $500 in flexible savings and minimal assets invested in the stock market. These are the median statistics, with 50% of Americans falling below this level. So that's kind of who he's looking to help with universal basic income.
Of people who are in the kind of elite, Andrew Yang definitely has more exposure. I mean, I feel like the elite is relatively segregated from this aforementioned normal person. But because of his efforts in entrepreneurship, I feel like he has more, although not like a lot, you know, but I feel like he has more experience with this, quote, normal person. So what do we think about how Andrew Yang relates to the normal person? Because this is an idea that I was kind of thinking about during the story is, you know, because this is supposed to help the, quote, normal person, he's defined that so clearly, you know, the book actually mostly focuses on like statistics from the U.S. Bureau of Labor, or what is it called? The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think that's what it's called, with the occasional mentioning of his conversations with people that are fit into this normal category. And so my first thought is like, how does Andrew Yang kind of understand this person? What are your thoughts?
That's something I was curious about as well, because obviously he's talking about all of these different entrepreneurs he's working with. And specifically, he kind of gives this doomsday scenario. Like half the time, these entrepreneurs are realizing that they're on this kind of path to a revolution, if you would, because of the growing inequality in America that they're aware of. However, he also points to the fact that none of these entrepreneurs are positing possible remedies for this. They kind of just accept it's happening. They don't even see a potential future that they themselves could help out with. And so I think his investigation comes from a lack of him not knowing, in a way, and traveling between towns via taxis and Ubers, like he mentions, to kind of get an understanding for the workforce, you know, in contrast to flying between the cities and going over these flyover states that a lot of them take place in, like the Midwest, where you have a lot of this automation. He talks about a lot of the states that are hit hardest by this are the red states. You know, people working in factories were one of the first people to be like automated out of a job. But he also shows that even like people in Uber, there might be 300,000 jobs that are lost by that shortly, by being replaced by the self-driving cars. And I think that's what a lot of this book was written on, or why he chose to run for president, was because he didn't understand it at first. And then because of this idea he had that, hey, we need to help these people, but I don't know how, he started talking to them and then realized kind of the core of their problems is their economic issues. And we might drop an infographic in here, but he mentioned some very interesting studies, how like if you run a psychological test, like an IQ test on somebody, they'll have a given median score. However, if you take that same group of sample individuals and tell them to figure out how to pay $3,000 in the next, you know, X amount of time, their IQ actually drops by 13 points. And he kind of delves into the psychology about how much money affects the normal person, or over 50% of Americans.
That, I think, is a big reason why he is for the UBI, although he does not talk about directly in that study, but it kind of sets the scene. But what the earlier part of what you're saying is, I think the answer is Andrew Yang, of all Americans who have plans to kind of address social inequality, I feel like is reasonably well conversed with the normal person. Because at the end of the day, I feel like it's kind of hard to talk to everyone, in that, you know, there are very many categories from the secretaries to the factory work. I mean, it's kind of difficult for one person to have actually talked to this like very vague and large group of people with various jobs. And so I feel like the effort that he's put into these conversations, I think, puts him relatively at a high place in terms of his knowledge of that.
Especially in comparison to some of the other presidential candidates we've had running in the past.
Yes. Um, but yeah, I feel like I was relatively happy with the clips that he had pulled out. Not the clips, the quotes that he had pulled out from people, because I find that people. This is the comparison I'm going to make because I'm presuming this is the intent of him including these quotes with regular people. Is that you ever hear a speech from a politician and they're like, and that's why I believe in this, because I was talking to this little girl who lived in this swing state that I need to win. And you know what they thought? They thought exactly what my policy is. And so I need to have this policy. You know when it's like more Andrew Yang's I felt like wasn't quite so staged. Mm-hmm. Which made me happier to kind of read those passages, because I do feel like that is like a classic politician move, is to have, you know, these go-to stories for this kind of stuff.
So what I really like about how this specific book was written is it's not as if it was strictly an advertisement. You pick up some of these politicians' books and you can tell the only reason they wrote the book, like in its entirety, was for public recognition or to win some sympathy points, or it's like strictly political gains. But the way Yang has kind of laid this out comes from a very personal and heartfelt place. And the way it incorporates like real data means a lot for me personally, because a lot of these speeches or debates that we'll listen to, especially like the recent presidential debates, they'll have these talking points. We are going to make new jobs. We are going to do this, but they don't lay out kind of the nuts and bolts of what it actually means to do the thing.
Yeah, and I think Andrew Yang definitely packs a lot of good statistics from the U.S. government in here, as in government provided statistics. You know, I think actually this makes for not very good speeches by Yang, but for a book, I thought it was pretty good. You have a lot of cool statistics. I think some of the more powerful ones were like the stagnation of median wage. I thought was pretty good, as well as the comparative increase in U.S. productivity, and then also looking at the increase in wealth in the very wealthy. I think this is, everyone who's paid any attention to politics knows that this is a major issue with the wealthy becoming more wealthy. And then finally, you know, statistics from how many Americans are employed in a variety of at-risk jobs of being automated. The aforementioned people that are in at-risk categories like automation, food service, truck driving, etc. And I was also surprised by how many individuals that is. It was like somewhere in the ballpark of like 40% of workers. It's insane.
And he gives the timeline on that of 5 to 10 years, if I remember correctly, on when this 40% of American jobs are at risk of automation. Of course, a lot of that depends on technology and regulations and what have you. The other statistic that really jumped out to me was year over year, since I believe 2000 it was, the amount of new jobs being produced in America was going down over 100,000 jobs per year. And it doesn't surprise me, but having those kind of like raw numbers in front of me, it shows how much our workforce is shrinking already at a like considerably reliable pace. It's going down 100,000 per year. But in addition to that, you have these other increasing inequalities, the wealth gap, as well as he talked about underemployment. You have a lot of these people going to college and then not getting a job in the field that they wanted originally.
This information, even though it's publicly released every year, is actually not talked about that much. And it actually surprises me a little bit, because just the fact that Andrew Yang can make like a public speaking career out of announcing stats kind of means that like you could probably, if you're media, just like, oh, the stats are released, just post the stats. USA lost 1 million jobs this year. I feel like people would care. But I feel like the stats are much more low key than you would kind of anticipate. And I feel that it was good to kind of see it up front, given that it's so important for like American well-being.
So with the actual UBI program, his kind of proposal is to give $1,000 per month to each U.S. citizen to the tune of $12,000 a year. And basically, he kind of picks these numbers to put them
18
around
through the end of life, though. I think that's an important caveat.
18 through the end of life.
Yes.
And then he kind of picks this to put people around the poverty line. And in my opinion, this makes a lot of sense. So quickly kind of comparing like why UBI versus like a welfare program. So I think a lot of people already know this kind of intuitively, but a lot of welfare programs punish you if you make too much money. So like if you're getting $1,000 per month and you take a minimum wage job that approximately pays out $1,200 to $1,300 per month before taxes, you would lose your welfare. You would not get the money for not working anymore. However, after that minimum wage income is taxed, you're down to in the 800 to 900 range. So a lot of the welfare programs now, that this would be kind of, what sets us apart from just another welfare program is the fact that this doesn't kind of put a ceiling on people that discourages them to work. This is kind of like a floor for people to work off on top of.
One of the main positives of the UBI is it's supposed to be, this social program to help those in more need while still maintaining that incentive structure that people don't like about welfare, like you mentioned. And one of the original thinkers behind universal basic income, he didn't call it this, but was Milton Friedman, who's actually an very libertarian person, slash, I think modern day like conservative, but he actually proposed, the negative income tax, where basically you would get paid if your income was under some certain tax exempt threshold in order to maintain this kind of incentive to begin working. And I think that is probably, going to allow the plan to be more favored among people who are worried about, the incentives behind welfare. Even people who agree that there should be more welfare, I think also are, worried about incentives. They want to hire the correct people to like manage the program. And, I feel like this is an important part of any social program.
And so, in your opinion, do you think like $12,000 a year or $1,000 is like enough to satisfy a lot of people? I know one of the statistics he brings up is the amount of retirees that are out of work, and how a lot of them, that's one of the worst things that happens. They start becoming depressed if they don't have work and they want to find additional meaning in their life. I think a lot of people, when they hear UBI and they hear, free money, get worried that you give this to people and they're going to get lazy and they're going to, not contribute to society the way they would have if they were, forced to work themselves out of poverty or work themselves into a better place in life.
From the data that we've looked at, it looks like $1,000 a month would be one of the larger UBI experiments. I don't think any UBI would have anywhere near this amount of scale and amount of payment. Like the frequently cited case for Alaska's UBI is $1,000 or $2,000 a year. So it's not nearly the same scale. And I think there's quite a bit of research done on whether UBI causes people to stop working. of the limited data that we do have, I mean, it's been attempted in small cases many times. You can argue about the how good these studies are, whether it's just like study selected 2,000 people. But most of these studies, will link some or show some right here, is that most of them show that you are not decreased in the number of work hours that you do put out. So with caveats, it appears that that part is not dramatically impacted, at least.
I see that a lot. One of the biggest killers, I'm very big into longevity and anti-aging, and this kind of comes up a lot with like your idealistic, future scenarios. It's often talked about abolishing work in a way and getting rid of this unneeded work. And I think one of the common counter arguments is that, work gives people meaning. Knowing they've worked for something is very beneficial. But in a lot of the data, that just doesn't hold true. People try to work, put in their 40 years, get their gold watch, and then retire. And they don't just sit around on the couch and watch Netflix all day. They start producing, other forms of assets for society, whether that is volunteer work, whether that is, care for their grandchildren, or whether that is art, or, what have you. Even in the case that some people would choose to no longer participate in the workforce, I still think there's good to the overall society, even if they do make that decision, which the data doesn't show that many of them would.
Yeah, I think another important part, if this were to ever theoretically roll out, would actually to be what is the narrative around this UBI that comes out? Because, I feel like Americans are significantly less willing to financially help their fellow citizen as other countries that are in similarly well-off positions. And so I feel like that is probably another like thing, because if people actually have UBI forced onto them, but they don't believe it's fair, how will that affect people's willingness to work? I feel like those ideas are probably pretty correlated. And so I think that narrative control is pretty important.
And
I feel like
we see a little bit of this with the kind of Alaskan experiment, and the way that the Alaskan politicians, I believe, when they created this back in God knows what year, it's like 30 or 40 years ago, they talked about, they said, hey, we have all this oil in Alaska. We have the option to drill for it and to sell it. And their UBI comes out of their oil fund. And they say, hey, you as members of this land, participators of this economy, this is a resource that belongs to you. Would you rather us as the government profit from it directly, or would you rather get a cut of what in a way is coming for you? So getting meaning attributed to it, Andrew Yang talks about how the American tech industry, coming out of Silicon Valley, where the automation is coming from is something that we should be proud of as a nation. And we should not feel like in a way that we did not work for this. Whatever your place in society, part of your contribution in a way is interacting with this automation, and you should get a cut of it if you do get put out of that job because of it.
Makes sense. In that America is the laws are set up to be quite pro Silicon Valley, given the freedom of speech and all this investment that's been done into technology. And I feel like this results in a lot of people's getting their jobs automated away from American technology companies, which makes a lot of sense. So yeah, the narrative around Alaskan UBI, I feel like is going to be quite different than the narrative around the national UBI, because like you said, if you live in Alaska, you feel like, oh, well, they're drilling into my backyard, so of course they should pay me, right? But in the US, I am not sure if there's going to be as much cohesion for an entire group. And I feel like that'll be very important if it were to succeed to kind of get that narrative right.
I do feel like we see a little bit of inherent opposition for it. I know in a few interviews or speeches, Yang was talking about talking to the truckers. And at one point, he asked some of these truckers, like, hey, are you worried about self-driving trucks? And for a year or two, they straight up said, no, there's no way they can replace us. And then when he came back to the same towns and said, hey, like there's self-driving trucks on the road now, are you worried? He's like, no, we're just going to pass laws against them. So there's like almost direct opposition to this kind of advancement of technology. So it will be interesting to see if the people do find meaning, like they help contribute to it, or if they're just going to be like recoiling from it and trying anything they can do to not let it happen. And I think that brings up a very interesting case. This is like a very hypothetical question, but in the scenario, we're a very individualist country, but in the scenario that we rail against this technology, this automation, but countries like China or India or some of these other powers, that have a more authoritarian slant, that their people aren't going to stand up against it. What happens in the hypothetical future that we pass laws and lower our productivity, but these other countries start passing us at a rapid pace?
That's an argument for like, we can't prevent companies from doing anything because that'll reduce our global edge. That's like a fear, that we need to maintain our own like corporate freedom for businesses to pursue whatever they please. And I think I am mostly kind of on board with allowing companies to pursue what they believe is the right thing for them to succeed. Because here's the thing, if you make it illegal to create a self-driving car, I feel like that is actually an extremely arbitrary law. Because if you think about what in the self-driving car is actually different from any other automating technology, I don't really know how much that's going to, like, I feel like that's a very strange place to draw the line,
Yeah.
Because you could say, oh, well, the automobile engine actually is automating away like millions of jobs for people who should care for, I don't know, a horse or like a cow or a mule or whatever. Like you could kind of point to anything and be like, oh yeah, that thing that's automating our agriculture, that thing is actually costing us millions. Like it's kind of like if you point your finger and you draw a line at autonomous vehicles, I think that's a very slippery slope. So I feel like Yang actually also mentions this in a like it's going to happen kind of way. That's not really discussed that much, but he very, very much has that mindset.
Or in a way, he's saying it's already happened. It is happening. He
Yeah.
talks about Amazon eating the e-commerce market.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one thing that I thought was incredibly surprising. Like, we all know that malls are closing, but actually having the stats put in front of you, it's kind of surreal reading about the impact on that. So I believe in one statistic he brought up was it's either 43 or 48% is Amazon's share of e-commerce. And he makes a very logical argument. He's like, brick and mortar stores cannot compete with this. He's like, they have too much literal overhead. They have a building and people to pay, so their products aren't going to be, as cheap, which it's a perfectly logical conclusion that Amazon's able to, provide these prices. But what I thought was astounding was he takes a look at the numbers of malls and main streets that are closing around the country. And it was something like he used Macy's as the example and was showing that one Macy's is closing every week or so. But the economics of what it means for a Macy's to close, he said out of the people that are paying, $22 million of income is going into that community per Macy's store. And then the taxes, the sales tax that the towns get from their 5% or whatever it is from taxing the sale of products is 36 million. So for every Macy's that close or similar size box store, you're having a loss of almost 55 60 million dollars per community. And how do you replace that? These towns that are losing this commerce, like what happens to them?
Yeah, so that's going to go along with our, the wealthy get wealthier, but it's also going to go along with a new kind of metric of that, which is the richest areas get richer. Because, if you're paying, if Amazon's paying the tax, all the Amazon stuff is in only a couple counties, right? Whereas the Macy's are everywhere. So in terms of spread of where the local taxes are going, it becomes more concentrated. And so that's another thing about online retail is there are way fewer online retailers. You got a couple big players, but that's just going to wrap it up. There's not really as much of a, mom and pop online. There's not really like shop at this online retailer, but they're delivering from close to you. There's none of that. There's none of that. And so that's kind of a problem in terms of, spreading around the gains to different communities, is that online is much more of there's only a couple people who really win.
And I think this leads very well into the conversation about how do we actually pay for this. The UBI, if it didn't have any losers, everybody would say yes to free money if the numbers line up, right? So how does Yang actually plan on paying for this, and where does the money come from?
Yeah, so he's proposing a value added tax, which is a lot like a sales tax, but it's supposed to hit at every step of value addition, meaning that if you are turning one product into this other product, you pay a tax during that process, as opposed to only at the point of sale with a customer. So it's supposed to be a little bit more fancy. And he also mentioned he mentioned a different thing when after he announced his presidential run. He did an hour-long meeting at some like New York City diner with two locals, where he also mentioned how it was part of his plan to target specific industries with his VAT. So basically, like with your VAT, you can be like, oh, well, sailing is a luxury industry, so we can increase the VAT of that area to a larger percentage than we should of, I don't know, food products. And
And
so he also talked about focusing it like in specific ways.
I think the number he gave in his book was, as an example, I believe the numbers is to fund this program adequately, you need to spend $1.3 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
And he puts in reference, and I do have this open here, that the federal budget's $4 trillion right now, and the entire US economy is $19 trillion. So that takes up a good section. But what he does say is he talks about existing welfare programs, and basically he would fold those into this plan. So if you're already making less than 1,000 a month, you would get bumped up to that, and then that program would be cut, thus funding this.
If you're making less than 1,000 from your social program,
yeah, exactly,
that'll get bumped into that. Yes,
and
not
then
your general income.
Exactly. And then for the remainder of the fund, he shows that a 10% VAT tax would be needed to fund the remaining portion, or at least in his kind of rough numbers from 2018 or whenever he was writing this book. Which I think that is something very interesting is he says for you not to come out ahead with the VAT tax, you would have to spend $120,000. That's not make $120,000. That's you spending $120,000 on goods that are taxed by VAT in order to lose more than $12,000 a year from the tax and not come out ahead.
So it definitely would be coming out ahead for all individuals. It's supposed to, also a thing that he mentions on the campaign trail as well as in the book is that, there is a new way to game the tax system as a large company. And I think software is like software VC, venture capital backed startups. They're all doing this where, okay, you get taxed on profit. So what do you do as a company? If you're realizing, oh, this year we're going to make 40 billion in profit, just spend the 40 billion and then you don't have to pay tax. So if you're Amazon, that means, oh, well, we didn't make 40 billion in profit. We're investing in this new building, and they go build a building in a random city. And we're also, we're getting 20,000 more employees, and we're also starting a new subsidiary company. And it's just like, in this way, the company kind of avoids paying tax because they don't have much profit. And if you look at, I think Amazon was one of the pioneers of kind of doing tax strategy like this, you know, they make almost no profit. Like, look at Amazon's statistics. Amazon makes extremely little profit. In fact, most of the years of its existence, it was operating at a loss, which is kind of insane for most people to grasp, but it's true. It only started very recently making a profit. And so you can kind of do that and avoid paying tax. But, you know, through the VAT, you would be kind of forced to, because you're making so much sales, it would kind of penalize these sort of style companies and these sort of style, you know, high volume, low margin companies.
Yeah, so this would be in comparison to taxing it at the top. So at the end of your quarter, at the end of the year, you show the government how much you've made, but if the money disappears because you've reinvested it, you don't have to pay taxes. But the value added tax says, hey, when you buy that machine where it works in your warehouse, you pay the tax if it's used in America. When you actually send the good out and the consumer pays for it, you tax it at that step. So you're taxing it at each level and not just the top level. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. So basically, you're taxing per sale rather than taxing after you do all the math of the year and look at how much profit you made. There is still like a corporate tax, but this is like separate from that.
Okay.
As in, there is still like some corporate sales tax, but this would be like an additional thing beyond that. Instead of like trying to hit companies with this, basically a company income tax. It's as opposed to that. So yeah, I mean, from everything that we know, I feel like big companies have gotten extremely good at avoiding paying any tax. So I feel like that's why I feel as if that is actually an even better idea than the UBI. I think the American public is actually even more for the VAT than the UBI, because most countries have VATs, and you know, it's a very good way to ensure that companies will actually pay you.
So it sounds like kind of, and granted, you know, I'm a little biased here, but it sounds like this is like one of the better economic systems that you can employ that is somewhat fair. It's not just a strict redistribution that we're going to take money from the 1% and we're going to redistribute it from like a central planning organization, or say that you can only spend this on food or you can only spend this on this sector. It's saying that because our country is prosperous and that, you know, we do have this automation, it's going to come in at every level, hit everyone fairly. To me, it almost sounds something like a flat tax, and then it's redistributed to cover up the flaws in our system. Because I think we do have to think capitalism for certain things like market efficiencies and whatnot, but it doesn't treat everybody fair at the end of the day. However, the UBI, I think, is a step at fixing that. And that's something I think that not a lot of people realize is we don't live in strictly a capitalist society. We are a mixed economy. The way our country runs relies on, you know, a guiding hand of the free market for efficiencies after production, but it also needs regulatory input to make sure it's not abused in certain sectors. So I think with automation, this is a new sector of abuse that's coming out, and this is really the first time we're ever encountering it, like proper.
Yeah, I'm gonna make the analogy of what if this were a person. So like, I think the VAT is a very good idea because it's like, okay, imagine you're a person and you make a certain amount of money a year. Like, let's say you make $50,000 a year and you spend $10,000, and then, you know, the government's like, okay, well, looks like you made 40,000 in profit, so we're going to tax you on that. But then it's just like, oh, but if I just spent 50K, then I don't have to pay as much tax because, oh, I didn't have profit. It's all gone. See, I spent it on all this shit that I bought. And so I think it's a much more fair kind of metric of tax payment, and also much easier to track because you don't have to track like, oh, is your profit really that? Because it's much simpler. It's per transaction. And so I think it's easier in that way.
She talks about this human-centered capitalism. Yang is he's a capitalist. He's an entrepreneur and he's built businesses in this. He loves this system versus some other books I've read recently, which look at the same problem and say, hey, automation is coming. We need to like socialize the workforce. Andrew Yang's like, no, we have a lot to thank the workforce for, but they have a point. Capitalism does not value things like childcare or playing video games. But he was talking about, like, in his 1% thing, that you could direct 1% of your taxes to pay for something. So if childcare isn't paid for, maybe you could use that 1% tax to, extend maternity leave for parents or what have you. I thought that was a very interesting point that was brought up in his campaigns, at least.
Yeah, so essentially the mentality is now you can get paid for some stuff you don't get paid for because we know that you're doing work that you're not getting paid for. That's essentially the idea, which I think is the same core idea as, other non-capitalistic thinkers that are just like, the point is not capital. People are so focused on capital bad. We need to start focusing on the things that you really do and love, And I think there is merit to that, although I don't see. It's kind of like the point of the capitalistic system is supposed to like incentivize you to do things that people need. And so I understand that for childcare, but I feel like the analogy is not going to extend very much beyond that, because childcare is still something that you would pay someone for, you know? But I feel like if it's just like, oh, but I want to pursue my art, I think that, you'll get childcare, and that's like very understandable. But beyond that, I need to, pursue life. I feel like that's the part where, the non-capitalists, the capitalists have a strong split here. And
Yeah.
that, one side is like, well, I need to pursue life. And one side is like, you need to do stuff that we need you to do. So that's the split there. And I feel like childcare is at that like kind of cutoff point.
What you were just saying reminded me of another big theme in the book, which was related to the unemployment rate and how that's actually like a false metric. And he talks about people just like straight up dropping out the workforce. So when these jobs get replaced, especially in these small pass-through towns where, say you work at a diner that primarily services truckers or whatnot, he was showing that like the median like worker in those towns like 49 or something, or pretty late in life, and probably couldn't reskill at that point. And he was showing that we have more and more people actually dropping out of the workforce versus finding these alternative careers, so that our standard unemployment rate is actually a false number. It doesn't actually mean what we think it means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he has a lot of speech on what the real unemployment rate is, which I think is mostly very good, because I think that we should all be using the percent of working age population employed metric. I think this is the most important metric for real, even though this one is never talked about, which in the US hovers around 60%, although ever since the 2007 stock crash has never actually gotten back to 60%. But I think that, his focus on this metric is actually very good, because I feel like it tells a much more true story on how many people are working, and it kind of leads very nicely to a bunch of his other points, like, reskilling doesn't work. And because we can look at this like overall population employed metric, and it tells us that, even when you reskill a group of people, they still, in terms of the group that is employed, doesn't make as much money and still aren't employed as much as they could be.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting. If you could put those two statistics together, which is, to reverse the one you just said, 40% of the working age adults in America are unemployed. If only 60% are working, 40% are not working. And out of the remaining 60% that are employed, how many are underemployed out of that amount? Because if I remember correctly, it was like 20 some percent on top of that, where people with college degrees were not serving jobs in their area of study. So if you take that 20% out of that 60, we're going to have somewhere along the lines of 50% of the Americans and in our nation aren't, providing back into society, at least in the form of capital. They're not generating taxes, or they're not, doing social services or what have you. So I think that shows kind of on a way that if only 1 out of 2 people in America are at a good job contributing in a meaningful way to society, what does that say about work going into the future? Like, if we already successfully automated away half the jobs, we should kind of see the path we're on, read the writing on the wall, and see what we need to do moving forward.
The overall percentage of people who are employed is actually not dramatically decreasing, even though that we have a very dramatic effect from this small reduction. It's only gone from a high of like ballpark, 65% around 2000 to 58% now. So it's not like crazy jobs are disappearing. Like it's only a 5% drop, but it has a very dramatic effect on us.
Yeah,
And
until,
so,
like he says, that other 48% get killed in the next 5 to 10 years via automation, those largest 5 sectors of our economy that
yeah,
are on the verge. So 50% of that 58% get cut in the
yeah.
next 10 years, then where are we at?
It's not going to be that dramatic, although I do think that this number is definitely going to go down in the next short foreseeable future.
And I don't
Um,
know if you want to extrapolate on the future from this point, but like, it is UBI a long-term like solution? He talks about, first of all, needing a supermajority in government to pass this in the first place, which sounds like it's going to take an extremely strong, political force that we're already having, polarization just passing our stimulus bill for coronavirus. So he does mention that, who are you going to be? Like, are you going to be the person that tells your constituents that no, you can't have the money? So he is very confident he can get the initial measure passed, but moving into the future after that, is this UBI going to be enough if the rate of automation increases even further? That'd be one of my biggest concerns for the policy.
yeah, and again, I'm going to go back to narrative around it and how that's important. And actually, this is super relevant right now because this coronavirus stimulus bill, that's basically UBI, right? Cash relief from coronavirus checks, that's UBI. And actually, Humanity Forward, Yang's nonprofit, is pushing very hard to strap on additional legislation onto those cash relief checks that are just like, we will also do this again in 3 months, and basically trying to do like it semi-recurring to see how people will respond to a slightly more UBI-ness to the coronavirus cash relief bill. And the reason why I say this plays so much into narrative is because if someone loses their job because they were laid off during the coronavirus pandemic, it's like, oh, well, they didn't deserve that. They should be helped out by the government because this is unfair. But in a non-crisis, when regular factory worker gets their job automated, it's like, oh, well, you should have worked harder. Like the narrative is so strong in terms of how it will influence people's decisions on whether or not this is okay. And we're seeing that play out live.
Absolutely. And I feel like we saw this in 2016 as well. I mean, Donald Trump's rhetoric, he never talked policies, but he told you to be afraid. And that's arguably what won him the elections. So I think a lot of people don't place enough value on that. Like, policy isn't enough, but it's partly about the story you tell to get you to your desired end.
If there was actually some reason that, you know, America goes through another crisis and Yang runs for president again, I think that would play very favorably because it's like, oh, life for everyone is very hard right now, and we need to kind of establish that it's okay to have this project that will make it, more even spread where the capitalistic gains go. So yeah, I think we'll see, because if more and more people, like, if we see the number of employed peoples dropping to like 48% in 10 years, then I think that there will be an ever the more strong push for UBI, because as it becomes more and more apparent, people become more and more aware, like, oh, like none of us are working, you know? And that's another interesting thing too, is this recoverable, this technology wave? Like, let's say that Tech 2.0 is okay, now we have these virtual reality headsets and this employs 80 million people a year. Okay. Now, do we still need UBI because everyone has a job making headset games? I also think that this is probably sad because that's the only way I can feasibly see that tech will actually add jobs, is if somehow VR adds 80 million jobs. But I'm imagining, like, can you go back? You know, when FDR started doing these these social programs, now you get Social Security. You can't go back. You give people Social Security, you can't take it back. Okay, you give people UBI, you're not going to be able to take that back. This is probably going to be what people expect from that point forward.
Unless we get VR headsets.
Now you have a government-sponsored virtual reality job.
That's your next big government microchip tracing unit, and just strapped to your face. They pull that extra data out of you.
You are required to play the game.
Please drink one verification Mountain Dew. But yeah, I think we can.
That's good jobs. You know, our government guaranteed jobs program. You have to start coding in the game. There's one more big thing that we didn't talk about. That he talks about, you know, a barrier for entry for a lot of people that's sort of related to the reskilling movement, is the dramatically increasing cost of college.
Yeah.
That is a chapter that I think we should touch on, because he talks about, you know, my parents are actually both in work for the university, and something that, you know, has been observed, and he actually observes in the book, is that the administration costs are going dramatically higher. Many of the largest public universities and private universities have more administrators than professors now. And so he talks about this being a huge barrier for people going forward. US News and World Report is killing schools because, since it controls what your school is kind of working for metric-wise, it controls like the fact that you only want to take rich kids because they'll improve your US World and News Report metrics. That's a big chapter in the book.
Yeah, and see, I don't have a lot of firsthand experience because I'm basically a high school dropout. But looking at the numbers as far as what he was showing, you had a relative same bar of administrative cost per student, if I remember correctly. But then your was it? I'm gonna have to look at the graph again. But just the areas that it was expanding in was just kind of stunning. And like you said, you have these algorithms that are ranking schools and forcing schools to focus on the wrong metrics. So it's not actually bettering the outcome of the student, but it's adding to their overhead costs because the students are paying for the university to run better programs, so they get a higher ranking, so they can provide, And it's just a self-fulfilling cycle, but it's like a negative feedback loop in a way.
Yeah. So, people complain about every metric in life. Okay. They're like, oh, well, if you make that metric, then people are just going to optimize for that metric, whether it's dollars, IQ, status, whatever metric you come up with, people hate the metric. But I think there is some merit to saying that the US News and World Report metrics are bad. Because, for an example, your school is rated based on how low your admission rate is. And so one can imagine that this is strongly disincentivizing, schools to do a variety of good things. And so, he hits on that. What do you think of the amount that Yang talks about in the increasing cost of college to be a barrier of entry for a lot of people, because he kind of talks about it for like a bunch of the middle section, and then he kind of just leaves it alone.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, even though it's definitely related to the fact that there are fewer and fewer winners in the modern day American society, it's kind of separated from the rest of the book.
Also talked about, so I believe it was his 6 in 6 kind of narrative,
Yes.
whereas you have 6 main areas of the United States that all your talent is going in, and all your talent who are pushing so hard for this nicer lifestyle are ending up in like majority one of 6 different categories. So he's talking about the main categories that we're teaching for at the moment are finance, consulting, tech and engineering, grad school, and law. And then based off 2015, they were ending up in New York City, Boston, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and yeah. So New York, California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Washington, D.C. is like one of the 6 places 75% of college graduates go to. So you kind of have this exodus of people leaving other parts of the country, gaining the knowledge to be successful, to make this wealth, to contribute to society. And all of that talent is going to one of 6 places. And the other areas of the United States are just screwed out of luck. Like,
So it's kind of like a US national-wide brain drain, in that you have a concentration of people who have all this status, but they only live in a couple places. And I think this is my own take, besides, stuff that I got from the book. My own take is that this is a reflection of the ever weak US antitrust situation. Because, look at the largest 500 companies in the United States. Several companies are really calling the shots. Okay. Which means that the cities that those companies are in are really like those hubs that are getting like a lot of, very high paid individuals. And then there's the after effects. For an example, you saw this in Silicon Valley. Facebook and Google start there. Okay. But that means that every tech company is now there, because they're just trying to mooch off the big guys, right? And so it really creates this cascading effect of, large companies, get talent to one place, and then people kind of just swap around companies regionally. I think that is the beginning of that effect, in my mind.
and that's kind of like the core message of his whole campaign, right? Is you have a few different sectors of our culture and our wealth that are being concentrated. All of our talent and all of our money is going to a very small set of people, and at the core of it, we need some type of redistribution so that the rest of Americans, through no fault of their own, are left depressed, starving, and suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of like the core message of the book, and his way of approaching that through universal basic income, through VAT taxes, is a very logical and, in my opinion, very fair way of doing it.
Yeah, I also would leave a very favorable review of the book. Um, it's, it's honestly, it is, yes, a I'm running for president book, but it still, keeps a level head, describes a variety, a bit about his life, a lot about America, and the direction the country is going, in a way that I thought were quite unique to his view.
Absolutely.
So,
All right, you ready to wrap up?
yeah.
Cool. So, everyone, this has been Past the Cover, where we dive a little bit deeper on books that we've read in our club. Would you like to spoil the next book that we might be talking about?
I think the next book that we could cover is Technological Slavery, which is the very controversial manifesto that was created by the Unabomber. But, on this topic of technology, I think is very interesting, because he talks about how society is more and more focused on technological improvements and less on actually making us happier.
It's going to fit very well with our most recent recap of the War on Normal People. But you'll be hearing about that more in the future. See you guys around.
Yeah. Take care.